that. Okay, we'll just pass this back and forth for the introduction. Okay. All right, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. We've had some wonderful presentations so far. So Greta Breckbill and I, Tim Kuckuk, would like to talk about our experiences with student musicians from middle school through the university. All right, so Greta and I are both very interested in hearing conservation for this population, and I'd like to start by defining a hearing loss prevention program as described by the CAOHC. And they state, a workplace hearing loss prevention program consists of noise measurement, engineering noise control, audiometric testing, hearing protection, employee education and training, documentation, and program evaluation. Well, as stated earlier, there are two governing bodies for this. It's the OSHA and NIOSH. And they enforce these programs, which are typically thought of in the context of factories, workshops, even the printing press room at the local newspaper. However, these programs do relate to musicians as well. And why, you might ask? Well, orchestral musicians are 4 times more likely to experience hearing damage than the average non-musician. And in a study of university music students, 45% of them were already experiencing decreased hearing. And that's compared to the 19% in the general population from ages 19 to 29, as stated by Kroll et al. In 2017.
So what does the research tell us about musicians' awareness for hearing health and their use of hearing protection devices? Olson and colleagues found that 69% of music students owned hearing protection of some kind, but 77% had never actually been trained on the risks of hearing loss or how to use hearing protection. In 2005, Leitonen found that 94% of orchestral musicians are concerned for hearing loss, but only 6% actually wear hearing protection regularly. So why so few? Some common reasons musicians hesitate to wear hearing protection are that they find it difficult to hear themselves and others play. They feel hindered in their ability to perform and communicate with colleagues, and hearing protection is just simply uncomfortable. So these studies just highlight the need for hearing health education amongst musicians, as well as the need for finding realistic solutions for their hesitation to wear protection. Now, why does all of this matter to us? A little bit of background on myself. I started playing the violin at the age of 7, and I pursued it very seriously all the way through college with the hope of becoming a professional musician. And never once during that whole time did anybody talk to me about taking care of my ears. And it wasn't until I began my studies in the Audiology department that I began to learn about the risk that musicians face for music-induced hearing loss and hearing damage. And this missing piece in my musical education kind of inspired me to participate in hearing loss prevention efforts at the UW School of Music.
And I learned of noise-induced hearing loss during my second year of the music program during my undergrad. So unlike Greta, I did actually hear about it. And my main takeaway from the audiologist at that time was that if I practice less, I will then have less hearing loss. So that gives you an idea of how serious a musician I actually was. Well, ultimately, that introduction to audiology really sparked my interest in the field, which brings me to my individual project. So thanks, Greta. I'll bring you back up in a few minutes. But so my presentation is titled Noise-Induced Hearing Loss in Middle and High School Students, an estimation of awareness, risk factors, and relevance. So that gives you a really good idea about what we'll be talking today. So I'll just dive right in. So my plan was to develop a presentation that increases awareness of risky listening habits for 12 to 18-year-old music students. Oh, there's a picture of the students. I would then create pre-surveys to assess their current level of knowledge about hearing loss, as well as get a sense of their music listening habits. And then use post surveys to better assess awareness and attitude towards hearing conservation. The survey questions were developed from previous studies looking at noise-induced hearing loss in teens and young adults, and I modified and expanded them to better fit my target population. And lastly, I would use Joe, our sound level meter mannequin, to test sound levels of personal music devices to give hands-on relevant feedback to the students. So my study aims, I had 3 questions I was looking to answer. Are students listening to their personal music devices loud enough to cause noise-induced hearing loss? Do students understand the risks to noise-induced hearing loss and the importance of protecting their hearing? And how do students rate the relevance of hearing loss prevention to their lives? So my audience and participants were Lake Mills middle and high school music students. All of them were ages 12 to 18, so 7th grade through seniors, and I had 179 participate. All the students were under the direction of Linda Heimstreet, who's their vocal music director. So one of my pre and post survey questions was selecting what the students think can cause hearing loss. We see the students have a solid awareness of this idea that earbuds and going to concerts can cause hearing loss, as well as a number of other things that I was looking at. And quite frankly, the pre-test scores were much higher than I expected, which relates interestingly to their understanding of hearing loss. As seen in a previous study by Martinez in 2009, teens understood that loud concerts can cause hearing loss. However, the majority of those participants showed absolutely no signs of changing their current habits. So, another question I asked was, what have you heard, seen, and or read about hearing loss? So an open-ended question for the students. And 34% of them stated not much, or don't know, or very little, something along those lines. And the other 64% or 66% responded with items like old people wear hearing aids, loud noises can cause it, it's common with old age, and a doctor just invented a way to restore someone's hearing. So, yeah. So almost everyone knows that loud music can cause hearing loss, but only 34% don't know really anything about it, or stated they don't know anything about it. So what we see from this data is that there's hopefully an increase in student understanding, with that decrease in the not much category in the post survey. That other set of data was derived from answers which listed a specific setting where they learned the information, such as in a school or a video, or from a specific person, maybe a parent or a teacher. I thought it was very interesting that only 8 students, or that 4% up there, mentioned receiving any type of hearing loss education in their school curriculum, even though there's a hearing loss unit in 8th grade and about 100 of my participants were in high school, so they've already had that unit. We see the increase in that category during the post survey simply because they stated the presentation that I had just given them. But of a similar survey by Chung et al. In 2005 found very similar results in teens and young adults, where only 16% reported receiving any education on hearing loss, and in that study only 8% thought of hearing loss as a big problem. So we're seeing a disconnect between the strong awareness of hearing loss and the not so strong understanding, application, and retention of what it actually means. So I asked the students to participate by measuring their devices, so iPhones, iPods, at a comfortable level where they usually listen to music. So that average from out of my 62 participants was 82 dBA. So by OSHA and NIOSH standards, that is safe. I then asked them to turn their devices all the way up, so crank them to the max, and that average was 104 dBA. So OSHA says that that can cause damage in about an hour, and NIOSH says that causes damage in about 8 minutes. And a handful of devices could reach 115. So that can cause damage by OSHA in 15 minutes, but NIOSH says that can cause damage in about 30 seconds. So just the discrepancies there, time intensity trade-off, which we've talked about already today. So on average, the students stated that they listened to their music about 2.6 hours a day, and 85% said that they use their devices while working out, that's either at the gym or going for a run, etc. So we can see how quickly that these devices can cause problems. And overall, I felt the students were really engaged and interested in the topic. And on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very relevant, we see that the students found this topic to be quite relevant to their lives. The average was 7.3. And here you can see the distribution of the number of students reporting at each relevancy number. And notice that there are very few students who found this topic not relevant, so over the 1, 2, and 3 range. So my conclusions, students do find this topic relevant to their lives. Many students do not know the dangers of risky listening habits, so they understand what can cause hearing loss, but are not quite understanding the consequences and dangers associated to that. Personal music devices can reach dangerous levels. However, on average, the students are listening at a safe level. And repeat exposure to this material is important, as seen by the low numbers of students reporting that they had received education on this topic in previous curriculum. And increased education on this topic is a very important idea and is shared by all of the aforementioned studies, and leads me to my limitations, which my presentation was only a single exposure to the topic. So, as I just said, we need more and more exposure to it. And also, I spent significantly less time with the middle school students just because of their class schedule. So I had about 30 to 40 minutes to present with them, whereas I had about an hour and a half to work with the high school students. Looking back at my survey questions and the answers from the students, some of the questions may have been a little confusing for them, and maybe I should have used a few less open-ended questions to make my analysis a bit easier. And then finally, a lack of control for the device measurements. So for instance, no one used the same song when testing for Joe. So that could cause a pretty big discrepancy in how loud the devices actually are. So some future directions. Continue outreach to the middle and high school students. First years thinking of capstone and outreach ideas. There are numerous possibilities within this age group. For instance, only 26% of the vocal musicians at Lake Mills, so who I was talking to, participate in instrumental ensembles. And we've seen that instrumental ensembles may, in fact, have a little bit more noise exposure than vocalists. And then also incorporating hearing screenings to better estimate hearing loss. So looking for those specific noise notches and even using potentially DPOAEs in the future. And then creating partnerships with other music programs, for instance, the university music programs, which we've seen at Stevens Point, and then Greta will talk about at UW-Madison as well. So my thank yous, a big thank you to Dr. Kroll for all of the support throughout this particular process and essentially facilitating everything. Linda Heimstreet, who allowed me into her classroom to talk with the students, and then the Lake Mills Music Department and the beautiful students. They were a very wonderful audience. And then my committee, Drs. Buhr-Lawler and Henning, for their support with today's presentation and throughout this process as well. And I just wanted to end with a quote from Mrs. Heimstreet, which I thought really captures the essence of my capstone. And she stated that, "I agree it is a valuable thing for students to get this information early in life. They are making hearing choices now that can affect them for life without realizing it." My pertinent references from today's presentation, and I will take questions now if you have any. Yeah.
When you asked the students to turn their devices up to like where they would normally listen to, were you in an environment that was like ideal, or was it with a bunch of people talking in the background that would cause them to possibly turn their device up?
It had a significantly raised noise floor, but the students, a lot of times they didn't put their earbuds in their ears before plugging it into Joe. So for instance, most of them stated, okay, I always listen to it at 6 clicks. Like this is just where I have it. This is how far over the volume bar is when I listen normally. So that was what we used. So there's another limitation to the study as well. If I had them always put it at the median or whatnot, could have been a different result. But good question. Yes, in the back.
I know when I listen to music on my phone, if I go past a certain level, it'll pop up a warning.
Sure.
This is damaging, whatever. Did you come across that with any of the students on their devices, or were they listening above or below that level?
I didn't notice it on any of their devices, that warning was coming up. Just out of curiosity, what manufacturer do you have for a phone?
I have the Samsung Galaxy.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, a lot of my students had iPhones. So just notice that I made. Any other questions? Yes?
I know you had indicated that in your initial survey you were kind of surprised that so many reported knowing that concerts and activities could induce hearing loss. Do you know if the school district you were in has any kind of dangerous decibels program that they would have maybe been exposed to this information prior, or do you believe that you are kind of first contact with that topic?
Yeah, well, besides for their 8th grade science unit on hearing loss, I don't believe that they had any other formal curriculum in that particular school district. All right, thank you. Let you get that. Should be all set.
All right, well, today I'll be summarizing my research on hearing health and hearing loss prevention at the UW School of Music. Just a brief overview. I'll give you some background on how I got involved with this research. I'll go over my methods and results, and then I'll end with a few discussion points, and I'll take questions. So some background. Before I dive into my research, I'd just like to give some background on the relationship between the UW School of Music and the UW Speech and Hearing Clinic. These two entities have been collaborating informally for about 10 years. And in 2015, the Speech and Hearing Clinic began working with the School of Music and the UW Occupational Health Department to develop and implement a hearing loss prevention program for students and faculty at the School of Music. I'd like to point out here that the UW system is governed by OSHA when it comes to workplace safety, and so faculty employed by the School of Music are therefore required to be enrolled in a hearing loss prevention program if their sound exposure levels exceed OSHA limits. And because students are not employed by the system, they are not required to participate in a hearing loss prevention program, so it's important to educate them on hearing loss prevention. This past October, the School of Music hosted a musicians' health symposium where multiple healthcare professionals talked to students, faculty, and members of the public about preventing music and performance-related health issues. And this is where my Capstone study comes in. So for my study, I came up with these 3 big picture aims. First, I wanted to assess students' hearing health habits. How much sound were they being exposed to on a regular basis? What was their awareness for music-induced hearing loss, and how were they protecting against it? Next, I wanted to help educate students at the School of Music by developing and presenting a talk on hearing loss prevention at the Musicians' Health Symposium. And finally, I wanted to find out what kind of impact this hearing loss prevention program was having on students. Were they inspired to protect their hearing? So here's what I did. I performed and analyzed sound level measurements, which I'll explain further in a bit. I created a presentation on hearing loss prevention, and I co-presented that with Dr. Buhr-Lawler at the Musicians' Health Symposium. And I created and distributed a series of surveys which I used to assess students' attitudes and behaviors regarding hearing health. So I collected 2 groups of data, sound measurements and survey responses. And for the sound measurements, I looked at student ensemble sound levels and personal dosimetry. The sound levels were actually measured last year by Jessica Sebula from the UW Occupational Health Department. Then for the dosimetry, I had 4 music students volunteer to wear a dosimeter for a day. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's just a small device that's worn on the clothing, and it measures and records an individual's sound exposure levels, typically over the course of an 8-hour day. Then for the surveys, I distributed paper surveys at the Musicians' Health Symposium immediately before and after my talk. And then I sent out electronic surveys for follow-up about a month later. The student attendance at the symposium was kind of low, so I sent out another survey to assess the general student population, and that survey was sent out through the School of Music email listserv. Now moving on to my results. Let's look at what I learned about hearing health habits and at the School of Music. So what is the sound exposure of a typical student at the UW School of Music? To answer this question, we have to look at how much students are playing their instruments, and that includes ensemble practice as well as solo practice. We also have to look at the sound levels that they are playing at, and dosimetry kind of gives us a good idea of how both how loud and how much students are playing. So in my survey, I asked students how much on average they practiced each day. And as you can see, most are practicing 1 to 3 hours or more on their own. And then this survey question asks approximately how many hours per week do you spend in group rehearsals or performances? And on average, students reported spending 7.3 hours per week playing in ensembles, although the range was really huge, as you can see, from no hours to 20 hours a week. 88% of surveyed students played in at least one ensemble. That's a pretty significant amount if you think about how each student or each ensemble rehearses for 2 hours twice a week, typically. So let's take a look at how loud some of these ensembles are. If you pay attention to the gold-colored line going across the graph there, OSHA recommends the use of hearing protection for anyone whose 8-hour time-weighted average sound level reaches 85 decibels. 8-hour time-weighted averages for each ensemble are represented by the blue columns on my graph, and as you can see, both varsity band and Latin jazz exceed that 85 decibel threshold. And then if an individual is exposed to a maximum level of 115 decibels or greater, at any point, OSHA requires the use of hearing protection. So on my graph, maximum levels for each ensemble are represented by the red columns, and as you can see, varsity band and symphony orchestra max out at 125 and 119 decibels respectively, which is incredibly loud. So if we kind of put the pieces together, how might individual and ensemble practice look like for a student in the context of a typically musical day? And this is kind of where my dosimetry comes in. The dosimeter comes up with a dose percentage at the end of a measurement period, which is shown in the last column. So exceeding a 100% dose within an 8-hour period puts the musician at risk for hearing damage. And as you can see, on average, my student musicians were pretty safe with about a 32% dose. But you'd be surprised at how quickly these percentages can go up. So let's look a little more closely at my trombone student here. He practiced solo for 44 minutes at an average level of 91 decibels, and that right there was 18% of his dose. Another 20% of his dose came from a 2-hour band rehearsal. So in total, he played just under 3 hours to reach close to 40% of his dose. Only 1.5% of his dose came from non-musical activities that he did throughout the rest of the day. So imagine if he had been practicing more that day, as many students do. And this is just a dosimetry readout for his day. On the left side is the sound level, and then on the right side is the dose percentage with time indicated on the bottom of the graph. And that turquoise region in the middle just shows how the dose was building up over the course of the day. I just want to briefly mention some of my findings on how students are protecting their hearing. This survey question asked, what % of the time do you wear earplugs? What I find striking in this graph is the high percentage of students who never wear earplugs. Oh. So that's during solo practice, that's 90%, seen in the red column. During group rehearsals and performances, 60%, that's the blue column. And during loud concerts, 54%. These are all not wearing hearing protection. And these were some reasons why students were hesitant to wear earplugs. I want to highlight these top 3 answers. 62% said, I can't hear myself and others. 55% said, it affects my ability to perform. And 43% said, it's uncomfortable. And if you recall from earlier in our introduction, this reflects some of that research that we mentioned. Moving on to some discussion points. So here are some things I took away from this study. There is a need for hearing health education among UW students. Based on my survey responses, I found that 31% of UW music students had never learned about hearing loss prevention. Efforts to increase hearing health awareness at the School of Music are still in the beginning stages, but students seem to be receptive. About 86% of students at the symposium said that this topic was very relevant to them. And students are gaining awareness for the availability of resources and hearing protection. I took a little retrospective look at earplug purchases at the UW Speech and Hearing Clinic to see if students were using our services to buy these custom musicians plugs. And since the beginning of 2016, we have seen an increase in these custom earplug purchases thanks to this strengthening relationship that we've got going between the School of Music and our clinic. So where do we go from here? I gathered a lot of preliminary data on this project, and I think the foundation has been laid for more in-depth examination. So here are some thoughts on future directions. The Musicians' Health Symposium should be a regular event at the School of Music. It should be held at a more convenient time to encourage higher attendance, and I think students should be offered some kind of incentive to attend, like extra credit. Higher attendance would just help us gauge the success of the program using those before and after surveys that I used. NIOSH standards should be emphasized. I didn't really talk about NIOSH, but it was kind of addressed earlier. Their more conservative criteria are just more appropriate for musicians whose craft relies on a good sense of hearing. So for this very reason, musicians' hearing loss prevention programs around the world follow NIOSH criteria or some equivalent. So I was a little bit curious, and I did a 2-minute quick check on myself using the dosimeter with it set to NIOSH standards. And the dosimeter predicted that after playing this way for an hour, and I was playing really loud and I was playing solidly for these 2 minutes, I would reach 140% of my daily noise dose. So recall my finding that most students practice at least an hour a day. By NIOSH standards, we might assume that they're overdosing on sound. And we should continue to keep track of custom earplug purchases through our clinic. This is just one way to gauge the success of the hearing loss prevention efforts at the School of Music. And then finally, I think hearing loss prevention efforts should extend to the Wisconsin Youth Symphony Orchestra, which rehearses at the School of Music. I checked out their website, I looked all over, I couldn't find any mention of a hearing loss prevention program or any kind of resources on hearing loss prevention. And many of these kids are rising musical professionals, and they really should be aware of hearing health issues. So this could be a good future capstone project. So that's all I have to share with you today. That's weird. That wasn't supposed to happen. Anyways, a big thank you to these wonderful people for supporting me through this project. My enthusiastic and always encouraging advisor, Dr. Melanie Buhr-Lawler, my committee members, Drs. Amy Kroll and Becky Henning, and a special thanks to Jessica Sebula of the Occupational Health Department, and Benjamin Schultz and Catherine Esposito, who helped me out at the School of Music. questions? Yes.
I wasn't really understanding, how did you get the dosage percentages? Like they had 100% of their dosage for the day. How did you get that?
So the dosimeter keeps track of the dose as it builds up throughout the measurement period. It samples, I forget at what frequency. And then there's this long printout at the end that you can look at. And I had the students keep a journal of their activity throughout the day so that I knew when they were practicing and when they were rehearsing. So you just like look at the dose percentage there, and that's how it showed me. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you.